Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, what promises to be an extremely interesting session, which we have entitled The Hybrid War and the Challenge of Peace in Ukraine. As you know, the Elь Kano Royal Institute has been following events in Ukraine very closely over the last few months, and it is therefore a great honor for us to be able to host this event with such an excellent array of speakers who have come from different parts of the world. Two of them are based in Barcelona, one of them is based in Germany, one of them is based in Kiev. And they will no doubt have slightly different views on the topics that we are going to address this morning, but I think it's a unique opportunity for us to be able to bring together such a distinguished group of scholars to discuss issues which are of great interest, and of course in Madrid it isn't all that often that we have this opportunity. So thank you very much for availing yourselves of this opportunity, and without further ado I will introduce them very quickly, and they will of course have to forgive me for my terrible pronunciation of their names. Our first speaker will be Sergei Suhankin, who is currently an affiliated researcher at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and he will be talking about Russian and Ukrainian far-right movements in comparative perspective. Our second speaker will be Alla Gurska, who is an associate analyst at the International Center for Policy Studies, the institution which is co-organizing this event, and let me thank the International Center for Policy Studies at Kiev for having made this possible. Let me also thank the International Renaissance Foundation for having provided some of the funding for this event. Our third speaker, she is going to talk about Why Does Russia Want Ukraine, which I think is a rather good little title, and I'm sure that we will follow her presentation with great interest. Our third speaker is Alexander Zabirko, and he is a professor at the University of Münster, and he is going to talk to us about the narrative of war, conceptualization of the Ukrainian crisis in intellectual and public discourse. And finally, last but by no means least, we have Georgy Kasyanov, who is head of the Contemporary History and Politics Department at the Institute of Ukrainian History. And he is going to address the issue of the Ukraine between West and East, dilemmas, options, opportunities, and threats. So as you can see, between them, they are going to cover a very broad range of issues. We have asked them to be extremely disciplined, as well as being extremely brilliant and interesting, and they have promised to speak for approximately 15 minutes each, and hopefully this will allow us to have a lively debate once they have addressed us. So without further ado, if you would like to take the floor.
Thank you very much. I would start with saying that a series of indigestible events that happened in the fall and in the winter of 2013-14 in Ukraine produced an avalanche of anti-Western and anti-Ukrainian propaganda campaign launched by the Russian mass media. And the pivotal thesis of this campaign lied within the fact that it was the Russian Federation that remained as the only stalwart of traditional Christianity and bastion of conservatism and traditional Christian values in Europe, whereas Ukraine was portrayed as a state falling within the hands of far-right movement and pro-fascist regime in Kiev. However, in order to understand the vicissitudes and the main stages of the far-right movement in the Russian Federation in contemporary times, I think that it is imperative to provide you with a very short historical background of how far-right movement was conceived in Russia, which actually happened in the beginning of 20th century in the so-called Black Hundreds movement. And it was a reactionary movement, an explicit reaction to both internal and external challenges that the Russian state and the ruling elites were facing. First of all was an acute necessity of modernization, both in economic and institutional domains, which posed an explicit threat to the above-mentioned groups within Russian society. Secondly, I would identify failures in both domestic and international arenas. And thirdly, it was increasing role of national minorities and very profound nationalization of the elites, which caused frustration and hatred from the side of the title nation. In contemporary Russia, I would identify three major stages that the far-right movement and the nationalist movement has been following. First of all, it was in the early 1990s until the beginning of 2000s, and it also had, I'd say, a reactionary spirit, reactionary nature. It was engendered by the vacuum, by frustration that was left, a fair share of humiliation that was left after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and a desperate attempt to find further path of development. In a sense, it was a peculiar combination between crude street violence, mainly represented by neo-Nazi movement, the militarized underground groups like the Russian National Unity, and very peculiar, I'd say, attempt to formulate the Russian idea by turning to the to Eurasianism that was conceived in 1920s. However, it would be absolutely heretic to stress any ideological connection between the Eurasianism of 1990s and the Eurasianism that was conceived by, let's say, Slavophiles in the 19th century, and further on by philosophers, the immigrants, Russian immigrants, because the classic Slavophiles, classic Eurasianists, they did praise European civilization and its impact on Russia, whereas the new Eurasianists, they practically tried to come up with a formula of the Russian nation consisting of Turkic and Western roots, which practically decreased European compound of Russian identity. The second stage started in the beginning of 2000 and proceeded until the year 2012, and it could be identified as managed nationalism, so-called civilization or imperial nationalism. Three major events facilitated promotion of this trend. First of all, it was the Kandapoga events in 2006, the Orange Revolution, and growing Russian neo-imperial ambitions, which had to do with expansionism in the Central Asia and the so-called territory of the customs union nowadays. During this period, the Russian propaganda and Russian intellectual circles tried to use more smarter, more elaborated ideas in order to somehow reinforce the nationalist movement within Russia. The first was to create so-called intellectual pool that was to consist of Christian values and the Soviet legacy. This found its reflection in Anti-Orange Committee, the Izborsk Club, and Florian Geyer Club. By taking closer look at agendas and ideas presented by these groups, one might get an impression that these were openly xenophobic, far-right, anti-Western, and even neo-fascist groupings. Such prominent Russian nationalists as Dugin, Mikhail Leontiev, Maxim Shevchenko, Nikolai Starikov, Alexander Prokhanov, Sergei Glazyev, Leonid Ivashov, Natalia Narachnytskaya came out of these clubs. And the second approach was by dissemination of national populist agendas to create a broad pool of nationalists. And it was being done via creation of Rodina political project, the Russian March, and the so-called Nashi movement. What the Russian state received in the final analysis was not an imperial nationalism, yet a combination of defensive nationalism, imperial nationalism, and ethno-nationalism, which put forth the so-called Fortress Russia concept and resulted in a strange alliance between the Democrats and the nationalists, which is a very peculiar situation, I'd say, because the main mottos and the main ideas, such as stop feeding the Caucasus, surging anti-Americanism, and anti-immigration rhetorics, is hardly applicable to the ideas that had been put behind the project. And this mixture of civilization, imperial, and ethno-cultural nationalism is quite difficult to fully understand and comprehend its impact on the Russian society nowadays. And the third stage started from 2011, perhaps 2012, with an article conceived by Vladimir Putin, Russia is mobilizing itself, and his Valdai speech on September 20th, 2013, when the use of such terms as conservatism came into Russian in the Kremlin's political vocabulary. This is by far much more sophisticated means that the Russian nationalists can use to defend their ideas and to promote their values and interests. To my mind, this is a purely instrumental meaning to delegitimize of political opposition and somehow facilitate nationalization of the internal elite, domestic elites. There is another point I would like to clarify. This is the war in Ukraine and the Crimean affair that obviously put a significant print on Russian nationalist movement. The scope and the final result is yet to be measured in full, but naturally it did have repercussions for Russian movement, which could have been traced during the last Russian March, which witnessed a significant rift between Russian and far-right nationalists. On the other hand, I would stress emergence of the anti-Maidan movement, which unites youth, sportsmen, intellectuals, politicians, and military veterans, as well as the Cossacks. This is a Kremlin-inspired project which is aimed to maintain so-called high conservative values among Russian society, and as a clear evidence that the color revolution cannot find roots in Russian society. Researchers now have been given a lot of thought to what is to the main ideas of this movement, whether it is the new Titushki movement in Ukraine, or is Russia returning to its historical roots, to the Black Hundreds movement, to those forces that would be able to thwart democratic ideas and democratic aspirations in Russian society. Well, it's been too short a time in order to make a far-reaching, consequential sort of notes. However, I would accentuate the fact that it was conservatism as a pivotal idea that stood behind the nascent ultranationalism in imperial Russia. And should internal conditions as well as external conditions change for Russia for worth, what kind of nationalist ideas, nationalist movement, what kind of forms will it acquire in contemporary Russia? And speaking of Ukraine, well, when we think about Ukraine, what image comes, what picture comes to our mind when we are speaking about far-right nationalist movement? Obviously, it is Svoboda and the right sector whose role has been exuberated by the Russian mass media. Well, in fact, Russian far-right radicalism can be divided onto two main groups. It is West Ukrainian and so-called anti-Russian nationalism and pro-Slavic nationalism to be found in central and eastern parts of Ukraine, such as the Ukrainian Patriot and an array of other movements. I would ascertain three major criteria in order to that are to measure the popularity of far-right movement, far-right agendas and ideas in Ukrainian society. First of all, it would be the popular support. Second of all, involvement in political games and decision-making process. And thirdly, historical memory and ethnic-cultural traits of Ukrainian as a nation. First of all, a popular support. Within past 24 years, far-right movements have not succeeded in Ukraine. The Ukrainian National Assembly, the most militant organization in the beginning of 1990s, was able to gain only 0.04% of the popular vote, whereas the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists were able to get 2.71 of popular vote, and the only exception was the political Svoboda political party in the year 2012 that was able to gain 10.44% and of popular vote and form the parliamentary fracture. However, the role of external forces are still being discussed, and it's quite premature to make any conclusions of the resources that had been allocated to promote Svoboda party, because according to the 2014 parliamentary elections, Svoboda was able to gain only 4.71%, which precluded it from entering the Verkhovna Rada. And the most vivid example of popular support would be the presidential elections, when Mr. Tagnibok and Mr. Yarosh received less votes than Vadim Rabinovich, a Jewish candidate, well, that's the most vivid support. Secondly, involvement in political and decision-making processes. It's been extremely limited, primarily due to the fact that both financial and political elites were never in Ukraine, have never been represented by nationalist circles. Incidentally, the last investigation conducted by Hromadske TV in Ukraine explicitly stated that these are Mr. Yarosh and the former leader of Ukrainian Patriot, Mr. Beletsky, who are the leaders in being absent in Verkhovna Rada, which is obvious that they are not very much interested in political processes going on in Ukraine. And thirdly, historical memory and ethnic-cultural traits of Ukrainians as a nation. I would particularly stress here cosmopolitanism, tolerance, and ethnic-cultural diversity that have always been an integral part of Ukrainian society. Moreover, the racist rhetorics, ethnic violence, and participation in military conflicts, both in Ukraine and beyond and abroad, have made Ukrainian representatives of Ukrainian far-right movements extremely unpopular within wide masses of ordinary Ukrainians. And the last question is the main thing, the clay that unites European far-right, it's anti-immigrant rhetorics. Well, in Ukraine, it is impossible to achieve because Ukraine does not enjoy much of immigration, and Ukrainian far-rights have never been endeared by their European counterparts. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ala Gurska is going to tell us what we really wanted to know this morning. Thank you. F5.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for being able to attend such an important event. And especially I would like to express my gratitude to the members of the Russian delegation whose presence here signifies that instruments of dialogue between parties involved in Ukrainian crisis have not reached their limit yet. Secondly, I would like to add some personal information about myself. I am Russian-speaking Ukrainian, half Russian, half Ukrainian, from the very west part of Ukraine. According to the Russian propaganda, the most nationalized part of Ukraine. But I would say that I will try to stay neutral and to stick more to the historical perspective. I would like to start my presentation with the following quotation put forth by the American historian James Mays. The main thing is that Ukrainians will never become a full-fledged people and an equal member of European civilization until power flows from the state to a self-organized people, able to force those in power to do what the people want. No state will ever make Ukraine Ukrainian. Only self-organized Ukrainians can do this, and I am deeply convinced that they will. Judging by factual compound of Ukrainian-Russian relations within past 24 years, I would say that national awakening has always been the worst fear of external forces while dealing with Ukraine, especially Russian fear due to the historical and other factors. This was the case in the year 2001 during Maidan Ukraine without Kuchma, 2004 during Orange Revolution, 2013 and 2014 the Revolution of Dignity. During the course of these events, the Russian side was keen to use its huge influence on Ukrainian society, political and economic environment in order to promote and defend an agenda of its own. However, the question remains, why does Russia need and want Ukraine? Within the broad array of facts and preconditions, I would identify the following ones. And the first factor would be I don't know what to do. Thank you. And the first factor, mounting neo-imperial ambitions of the Russian Federation. Without Ukraine, Russia cannot become a truly Eurasian empire. My point can be reinforced by the quotation put forth by the Zbigniew Brzezinski in the year 1997. Ukraine, a new and important space on the Eurasian chessboard, is a geopolitical pivot because its very existence as an independent country helps to transform Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. However, if Moscow regains control over Ukraine with its 52 millions in 1997 of people and major resources, as well as access to the Black Sea, Russia automatically again regains its ability to become a powerful empire state, bounding Europe and Asia. On the other hand, as Lilia Shevtsova said, Ukraine is of immense importance to Russia. First of all, Ukraine signifies the protection of Russian history and subsequently statehood. Secondly, through Ukraine, the Kremlin protects its legitimacy. Thirdly, Moscow wants to prevent the Maidan from happening in Russia. Finally, it is a challenge to Europe and West. The second factor I would like to point out is geopolitical ambitions. Russia aimed for Ukraine to be used as a bulwark against NATO, against NATO eastern expansion, from Baltic to the Black Sea, for forming so-called protective belt. By the way, the eastern expansion of NATO still remains a matter of serious apprehension for the Kremlin. The third very important factor is economics. Naturally, within the new Russian-promoted Eurasian Economic Union, Ukraine, with its tremendous natural resources, comparatively developed industry, for example, the Satana rockets and a number of joint high-tech projects between Russia and Ukraine, as well as high intellectual potential of Ukraine, were supposed to be a cornerstone of the new regional structure. And the last factor that I would like to identify is civilization. With the mounting ethnic nationalism in Russia, Ukraine, with its predominantly European Orthodox population, was seen as a natural hedge against proliferating non-Russian Muslims population and migrants from Central Asia. I would reiterate again that in order to thwart Ukrainian accession to Euro-Atlantic structures, Russia would use all the means possible. The example of Russia-inspired separatists in the southeast of Ukraine, as well as annexation of Crimea, are the most vivid examples of my point of view. Nevertheless, while luring Ukraine interproliferation and expansion of ties with the West via signing of association agreement and support of the Maidan movements in the autumn 2013, the Western community should have realized the possibility of repercussions coming from the Russian side. I would particularly spotlight that the Russian side has never concealed its agenda and aspirations in Ukraine, and the Western community should have anticipated the possible consequences and outcomes. Should Russian interest be underestimated in this post-Soviet country? Therefore, the current regional conflict that has already claimed thousands of lives should be mitigated by all sides involved in this conflict from the very beginning. After all, one needs to keep in mind that due to its geopolitics and history, Ukraine has always been hostage and therefore should be treated with applications of various factors and in the light of multidimensional perspective. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the possibility to speak here. As a literary scholar, I'm going to speak first of all about the rhetorical strategies and the narratives which are used to interpret or to explain the so-called Ukrainian crisis. Let me start with some theoretical framework and then move to more specific questions on the ground. I will argue that the war in Ukraine was above all created by the clash of the distorted perceptions, myths, and emotionally charged narratives, both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, as well on the side of the European Union and the United States. The debates on the so-called Ukraine crisis demonstrated that large parts of European society still understand the world politics as the politics of power and might. That is a form of international relations in which sovereign entities protect their own interests by threatening one another with military, economic, or political aggression. The opposite viewpoint, which also has been quite frequently articulated with regard to the situation in Ukraine, analyzes existing geopolitical tensions and conflicts not as a permanent struggle between cultures and nations, but rather view them from their legal and civic perspective, or in a narrow sense from the perspective of international law. In Central European, or more precisely in German intellectual tradition, this kind of opposition is usually connected to the names of Carl Schmitt and Hans Kelsen. The initial ideas of Schmitt, one of the founding fathers of classical geopolitics, experienced some terminological changes over the recent decades, but remained essentially the same in the text of his followers. So one of the central arguments here is the assumption that politics must submit to certain imperatives inherent in the so-called order of the continental spaces, or in German, Großraumordnung. That is the organization of countries into large territorial blocks under the guidance and political control of sovereign hegemonic states. And every of these hegemonic states, or so-called core states, Kernstaat in German, has a free hand within its subordinate geographical space and organizes this space economically and politically. Schmitt's ideas of describing the world found its second life in terms of political orbits coined by Walter Lippmann, and later in the cultural zones of Samuel Huntington, in which those respected researchers ultimately divided the whole globe. On the contrary, the legal positivism of Kelsen, one of the legal architects of the United Nations, not only binds this geopolitics by the rule of law, but also proclaims the universal character of the same rules and regulations, like human rights, for example, and requires the general adherence to those rules regardless of the cultural and ideological background of political actors. Kelsen's doctrine of the peace through law became manifest in the numerous international legal organizations, courts, and tribunals, yet the same doctrine paradoxically legitimized the ancient principle of justum bellum, or righteous war, as an ultimate way of law enforcement. That is, if a country breaks the international law, then the law can be restored by military means as ultima ratio. The short 20th century, and especially the era of the Cold War, witnessed the coexistence of both of these theoretical concepts. The establishment of a number of international legal institutions and the UN occurred in the same time when two hostile political orbits were permanently balancing between the periods of escalations and deterrent. But at the same time, the commitment of the communist regimes to the principle of international law and human rights was at least a subject of significant doubt all the time, giving the impression as if potentially universal principles of peace through law were functioning only in the countries of the West, while already outside the Central Europe began a fundamentally different world, the world of geopolitics. So the general point I'm trying to make here, considering the current situation in Ukraine, is that in today's Europe, the Ukrainian question is, above other things, the issue of choosing an analytical paradigm and the language of analysis. Why here in Europe the geopolitical worldview remains so powerful and persistent when we are talking about the situation in Ukraine? First of all, it has to do with a general understanding of Eastern Europe as a region where laws and legal norms doesn't work properly anyway, so it is only logical to abandon them altogether when speaking about the conflicts in this particular region. Another important issue, which at least partially can serve as an explanation for the persistence of geopolitical perspective with regard to the Ukrainian crisis, is the entire challenge of Europe's identity building. So over the centuries, Europe has been defining itself through the opposition to different Eastern empires, like Persia, Byzantine Empire, Ottoman Empire, and finally the Russian Empire, including its Soviet hypostasis. Furthermore, over the last 2 decades, the European Union, as we can see, was growing exclusively in the eastward direction, and not, say, to Africa or Middle East. So it is precisely the Eastern Europe where the European project can reach its geographical and geopolitical finality. However, this finality can only be achieved at the point at which Europe meets its other, a non-Europe. And apparently, Putin's Russia has become a sort of anti-Europe organized by geopolitical reasoning and bound by military power. The Kremlin's official rhetoric sees Russia as entirely different from the EU in social and political norms. And this is exactly the point where these Russian self-perceptions meets the European identity deficits. So Russia, as a core state with its legitimate interests and within its own cultural orbit, ceases to be a country like any other European country and becomes Europe's other. So finally, what does it all has to do with Ukraine? First, it influences the interpretation of the EU association agreement with Ukraine, a document which arguably triggered the whole Ukrainian crisis. So if we stay within the geopolitical paradigm, then we tend to define this agreement not as one of the many milestones in the European rule-based integration, but rather as Brussels' deliberate intervention to Russian cultural orbit. This perspective already opens the door to the war of pure geopolitics. However, in order to accept this geopolitical paradigm, one must make another decisive mental step, and that is deny Ukraine's role as a subject of international politics and international law, and present this country merely as an object which should be administered by other sovereign states. So think about the metaphors of Czechoslovakia and divorce or Finlandizations, which are frequently applied to current Ukrainian situation. This step, the denial of Ukraine's subjectivity, is not without risk, considering that Ukraine is a member of dozens of international organizations. But surprisingly, many experts and politicians still manage to achieve this infamous goal by using some tropes and metaphors which strongly influence the whole discourse of the so-called Ukraine crisis. One of these is the metaphor of Ukraine as a cleft country. In Ukraine itself, this stereotype has consolidated in the formula of two Ukraines. According to this formula, there is a distinction between a nationally conscious, predominantly Ukrainian-speaking, and, say, kind of creolized, mainly Russian-speaking Ukraine. This linguistic divide is illustrated here by the number of native speakers of Russian in blue and Ukrainian in gray. The popular discourse of two Ukraines assumes that the east and the west of the country have different cultural identities based on distinctive historical memories and different, often mutually exclusive values. The idea of the Ukrainian split became especially popular in the time of the Orange Revolution in 2004, when the international media gladly started to describe Ukraine as a deeply divided country where pro-European liberal West lives in a dramatic opposition to a Soviet nostalgic and Russian-friendly East. So illustrated here again on the electoral results of 2004. And closely connected to the metaphor of two Ukraines is the trope of Ukraine as a failed state. This connection is all too obvious because the notion of failed state in Ukrainian case is not restricted to some profound examples of bad governance. Well, in fact, some European countries can provide similar examples, but exactly because of this regional East-West division, which supposedly illustrates the lack of national consolidations or of a nation as such. And where there is no nation, there can be no nation state, and thus the state fails literally. Well, this trope, this metaphor of a failed state, This is the second point in which the Western geopolitical worldview meets the official Russian rhetoric. So as soon as you accept that Europe has intervened into the Russian regional orbit, and as soon as you accept that Ukraine is not a real state and Ukrainians are not a real nation, then you have moved very close to this Russian geopolitical position. And as soon as you accept this position, you are in the world of geopolitics and power as opposed to the world of European norms and law. The tale of two Ukraines is insofar a typically geopolitical issue as it equates language, region of residence, and political orientation of all Ukrainian citizens. In other words, it rejects the civic identification of a person and reduces his or her identification to some objective criteria like ethnicity, language, or race, which are usually, well, fixed or inborn. And this is probably one of the central misconceptions of the Russian narrative on Ukraine. Unlike the Spanish discourse, where it is perfectly normal to use such terms as los países hispanohablantes, well, Spanish-speaking countries, in today's Russia there is still a very limited understanding of the post-imperial character of Russian language and culture. And therefore, the official rhetoric of Kremlin normally called the Russian-speaking population abroad as compatriots in Russian, соотечественники, despite their foreign citizenship. At the same time, denying Ukraine its distinctive national identity, Russia suggested alternative identities instead. And they were largely based on the concept of Русский мир, that is, Russian world, which during the 2000s advanced rapidly from being a marginal intellectual discourse to a mainstream ideology supported both by Russian state and Russian Orthodox Church. Русский мир refers to a supranational community united by Russian culture and language, by historical memory and traditional values, by the same religion, and more importantly, by a loyalty to some kind of metaphysical, transcendent Russian state, which includes both Russian Empire and the USSR. To re-identify this other Ukraine, Russian media at first used the geographic designation of Yugo-Vostok, this is southeast, which, however, had an important weak point: it was still Kiev-centered. Later, the much more powerful geohistorical concept of New Russia, or Novorossiya, was coined, which reduces several Ukrainian territories to a historical region attributed to Russia. The concepts of Русский мир and Novorossiya belong to the central rhetorical devices that comprised the Russian-backed narrative on the popular uprising in the eastern regions of Ukraine, which in turn led to the establishment of the so-called People's Republic of Lugansk and Donetsk. Thus, already the preamble of the Constitution of the Donetsk People's Republic contains countless references to the notion of Русский мир, which serves as the legitimizing principle for revolt, as well as the historical basis and ultimate political goal of a newly established republic. But paradoxically, this Russian media intervention and military intervention have done what previous Ukrainian governments had failed to achieve, and that is to catalyze the creation of political nation in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian identity, which for so long had been associated with ethnicity, language, and historical memory, suddenly has become territorial and political, and thus inclusive for Russian speakers, for ethnic Russians, as well as for Russian citizens with other ethnic origins. Probably the most prominent examples of this shift are Crimean Tatars, the autochthon Muslim population of the Crimea, who remained largely loyal to Kiev after the occupation of this peninsula, and who are now perceived and celebrated as true Ukrainian patriots, exactly because of their ethnic and religious otherness. So what formerly was considered an obstruction to nation building now has been reinterpreted as a kind of value. So this new hybrid understanding of Ukrainian is based on social and civic components rather than on ethnic or cultural foundations, and it's exactly this shift of paradigm and not so much the overthrowing of Yanukovych regime which makes Maidan a truly revolutionary movement. So if we take Benedict Anderson's definition of nation as an imagined community, then I would argue that Ukraine has been reimagined through practical steps by hundreds of thousands of people in public debates. And this reimagining, however, remained virtually unnoticed by many foreign political analysts because this process was not a part of kind of top-down administrative project. And the political elites, busy with redistribution of power and economic resources, had played no positive role in it. Finally, in order to understand what happened to East-West divide, we should first of all understand where the East lays today. When the European media speak about the war in eastern Ukraine, they usually refer to the region of Donbass, a former electoral stronghold of President Yanukovych's party of regions. Still, as polls from before the uprising show, even in Donbass, despite some grievances with Kiev, only the minority wanted to leave Ukraine or join Russia. Opposite to Crimea, where there was political and social support for separatism, Donbass was a military issue from the start. That is, separatists had to take up arms because they lacked support, and they had to get support from Russia because even with arms, they were too weak to counter the Ukrainian army. So no doubt that the official Ukrainian narrative of anti-terrorist operation rather obfuscates the local anti-government sentiments, but separatism is a military conflict between Ukraine and Russia now, not an internal one. The role of Russian forces within Ukraine was evident from the start of the crisis, but gradually became even more overt as indigenous separatist forces were unable to cope. And this resulted in a shift in the character of the crisis over the course of 2014. It moved from an extremely sponsored insurgency in eastern Ukraine to a limited war between Ukraine and Russia, albeit one with some unique features. This is not total war. West armies do not move against each other. Moscow capabilities are held in reserves, and shaky ceasefires are announced from time to time. But more importantly, the conflict parties are trying to sustain their official narratives, that is, the Russian narrative of the popular uprising on the one side and the official Ukrainian narrative of the anti-terrorist operation on the other side. The problem, however, is that the idea of limited war also requires some sort of shared understandings about thresholds and boundaries. This pointed to fundamental tension in Russian objectives from the start, between carving out a chunk of Ukraine that would be effectively controlled or even annexed by Russia and gaining influence over the whole Ukrainian state to prevent moves inimical to Russian interests. And this is exactly kind of discourse trap which makes the policy of separatist republics full of contradictions. So having proclaimed their full independence from Kiev, they also demand the federalization of Ukrainian state and the right to determine Ukraine's foreign policy. Finally, in terms of theory of limited war, the case of Ukraine confirms that in disputes over territory, the most effective forms of control involve regular armed forces and superior firepower. Control, however, doesn't ensure a functioning economy and society. So while the towns of Donbass, which were reconquered by Ukrainian army in summer 2014, quickly returned to kind of normal, or more or less normal life, the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk became the site of rapid demodernization and dehumanization of the society. There is no legal system there, no functioning security organs, no banking or financial system, etc. So the kind of bitter results of all those distorted perceptions and clash of narratives is that there is simply no Donbass to be won over by Kiev or Moscow anymore. About almost 1.5 million refugees already escape and vote by feet, either escape into Russia or into central Ukraine. Young people who are fighting for one or other side, voluntarily or not, are unlikely to be won by the side which tries to kill them. And the remaining population will probably welcome just any side which will bring law and order. And on this admittedly not very upbeat note, I make a full stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, probably my report will look like an extension of previous one, because I also will speak about East-West divisions and different perceptions of what's going on in Ukraine now and about how Ukrainians perceive themselves in terms of East-West division. So there is a number of paradigms which are discussed and presented, represented, perceived and conceived in Ukrainian intellectual debates, political debates, and representations and self-representations. So the most basic is that Ukraine belongs to the West or to Europe, and that Russia belongs to the East. And that Russia is an Eastern autocracy, and West and Ukraine, as a part of the West, is an eternal democracy. So generally, the most basic myth about Ukraine is that Ukraine is a natural part of the West and of Europe, and that historically it belongs to Europe, culturally, psychologically, whatever. So this is the dominant myth. Of course, this myth is combated by other, which is about belonging of part of Ukrainian lands and Ukrainian history to the East, to Russia, or even to Oriental civilizations like Ottoman Empire. So, and all this myth has a kind of grounds in reality, in historical reality, in representations of this historical reality, which is, you understand, that it's a kind of imagined reality. So another option is that Ukraine belongs to the territories which are situated somewhere, located somewhere between East and the West. So, and that Ukraine belongs neither to the East nor to the West. And this, in this case, we can go to another paradigm, is what's Ukraine as a borderland between East and West, where East and West clash for something. So another option is that Ukraine always served as a barrier between East and the West. For instance, in medieval times, Ukraine served as a barrier against Eastern nomads, which helped to protect West from the influx of nomads to Western nomads to the West. Then, most probably more advanced vision of Ukraine is that Ukraine is a kind of contact zone between East and West, where East and West meet, and then when they exchange with their cultural heritage, and then Ukraine can be represented as a kind of place where East and West meet, and where they can interact. And then Ukraine as a bridge between East and West, which connects East and West, and when so like a cultural transport category. Then now one of the representations is that Ukraine has become a conflict zone, a zone where East and West meet in the conflict, and this vision now also predominates the minds of some politicians, and it also leads to certain decision making. So Ukraine is also represented as a crossroad of different civilizations, cultures, languages, histories, legacies, etc., etc. However, what is also important is that Ukraine also has its own East and West, which is directly refers us to this Huntington's idea of clash of civilizations, and the frontier between East and West within Ukraine is moving depending on the point of view of those who try to represent Ukraine as divided, so-called two Ukraines dilemma. And finally, Ukraine is represented or misrepresented or overrepresented as the east of the West. Now, after European Union enlargement, Ukraine, together with Moldova and Belarus, is represented as a part of the space which is now a east of the West, most eastern part of the Western world, and even term Eastern Europe, which some people trying to forget, is now applied to these territories, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Now this is Eastern Europe, and Eastern European countries and nations do not want to call themselves Eastern Europeans. So, and finally, Ukraine itself sometimes represents itself as a, Ukrainians represent themselves as a west of the east, as the most western part of these territories, as in this case, as most advanced. So I would like to go to other sides of the picture. This is a humorous map of Russia. You know, this serial, there's a lot of this kind of maps. How Russians in humorous terms can see the Europe and Ukraine. And this is very interesting. It's a joke, but it's really great idea behind this, is that Russians perceive Ukrainians as a southern Russia, and that Ukrainians are not others. This is the major, probably one of the greatest intrinsic features of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, when Russians cannot imagine Ukrainians as others. Ukrainians are ours, and this permits the whole thinking of Russian politics, Russian public, Russian cultural figures, etc. And when some part of you, your right arm or left arm, whatever, trying to leave you, it's real tragedy, and it's real conflict. It's real internal conflict, and conflict goes to be, should be also external conflict. So it is a real problem, both for Russians and for Ukrainians, that Russians, virtually, majority of Russians, virtually unable to perceive Ukrainians as others. So, and this can also be translated into kind of politics, whatever. But I'm going back to Ukraine itself, and I also presenting different kinds of spacing, imagined spaces which were represented by different parties in different times. So now you see the map of presidential elections of 1994. I would like to remind you that exactly in 1994, the CIA has published a report, public report, on possible split of Ukraine, political split of Ukraine, exactly over these lines, which you can see here. It was division on linguistic lines, and additionally, one of the presidents, one of the rivals, Mr. Kuchma, was considered as utterly pro-Russian president. So that was about, once again, about East and the West. So 10 years after, there were another elections, and once again, there was split between certain areas of Ukraine, and Yushchenko was considered as pro-European president. He was not, by the way, but he was considered as a pro-European president. I mean, by his culture, habits, etc. And by Mr. Yanukovych, who was, of course, represented and considered as a utterly pro-Russian president. He also was not, by the way. So, and then something has happened. In 2010, Yanukovych has become a president, and then there were a lot of policies, moves, shifts, which reportedly urged us to think that Yanukovych is pro-Russian, under-Russian president, that he follows Russian policies, and that his opponents, his rivals, are pro-European. So in this case, in this context, to be anti-Yanukovych and anti-Russian was to be pro-European, which is also not true. So then everything happened, what happened, and then we see the map of presidential elections of 2014. And what we see now, the pro-European, so-called pro-European president, Mr. Poroshenko, and this is covered with the deep red. This is support for him, and pro-Russian and let's say pro-Putin candidates are in under figures 1, 2, and 3. So decisive minority. So this is about Ukrainian, once again, about Ukrainian position between East and West, about permanent position of push me, push you, pull me, push you, as you see this, the first picture. And we can see the tendency. As more Ukraine goes, majority of Ukraine goes further to the west, so, and then as more problems Ukraine has with Russia. And of course, there is a lot of so-called lawyers, well, the avvocati diablo, who speak for Russia and try to explain why Russian behavior and behavior of Putin, etc., etc. So, in Ukraine, when you have discussion on that, and someone tries to speak about Putin's position and try to explain it, so it is always perceived as someone goes to the other side, which is really bad because it does not give a space and opportunity for analytical and rational discussion. And of course, it's not easy to have an analytical rational discussion when you have country in war. So we go back to these divisions and the dynamics. Look at this table. You will see that in May 2014, it is made by, this polling was made by quite respectable sociological service. So you see that how internal regions of Ukraine divided on their attitudes towards West. You see in the West is predominant support for accession to EU, and just 1% of those who were asked would speak for the custom union with Russia. So it is also interesting that the share of those who in the East who are thinking about accession to custom union is 67%. Still, majority of those who are there, they still are utterly pro-Russian. So it's all Ukraine. Then let's see let's look at the regions, and then you see the same picture, this kind of division of attitudes, and then you can see this in dynamics. You see that share of supporters of pro-European course is growing from year to year. And the share of those who support pro-Russian, pro-custom union is diminishing. And is also alarming is that a considerable share of population, those who do not want to belong to any part of this divided world, which means that people are frightened by the conflict and they do not want to provoke further conflict. To sum up, I would say that this position of Ukraine between East and West, well, so-called East and so-called West, of course we understand that all this is just imagination which is translated into kind of politics and retranslated back from the politics. That this situation now is really changing. And the open conflict between Ukraine and Russia and war in the East and position of Mr. Putin, and, which is not, let's say, I think that it's not far-looking position. It's the thing that Putin, if there would not be Putin in reality, Ukrainians would have to invent some kind of Putin. Because Mr. Putin helped Ukrainians to make decisions. And Mr. Putin, with his actions, did his best to unite Ukrainians around certain idea. And this idea is finally stopping this kind of ambiguity between East and West and finally move to the West. In this case, what Putin does now, it looks like the most pro-European politics of Russia. So at this point, I would like to stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, well, let me first of all thank our speakers for those very interesting and I would also say very subtle and nuanced presentations. I'm an academic historian by training, so it's nice to be able to spend some time listening to people talking about imagined communities again, and constructed identities and others. We frivolous, superficial think tankers don't normally dwell in such an elevated plane. And since I am a frivolous and superficial think tanker, before I give the floor to anyone in the room who may wish to pose any questions, I would like you to think about two issues, if I may. The first is retrospective, it's backward-looking, and the second is forward-looking. The first is, I'm sure you've all been asked this before, but it's a question that I think is still of interest and relevance. What mistakes do you believe the West, and by the West I'm going to specifically mean the US, the EU and NATO, what mistakes do you think the West has made in dealing with Ukraine over the last couple of years, perhaps even decades? What did we do that we shouldn't have done? And of course, as an EU watcher of some 30 years standing, I find it quite amusing to see the EU portrayed as this incredibly powerful, aggressive entity. I'm more used to the EU being dismissed as a bunch of postmodern wimps. But still, you know, it's welcome criticism. It's a new way of perceiving ourselves, of course, and we are, as you have all very cleverly pointed out, we are talking about perceptions. And immediately in direct connection with that, what didn't we do that we should have done? Okay, so what did we do that we perhaps shouldn't have done, and what did we fail to do that might have prevented the current crisis from emerging? Perhaps it has nothing to do with the EU and NATO. But looking forward as well, I think this is probably interests a lot of the people in the room. Where do we go from here? What is your gut feeling? You all know Ukraine well, you all know Russia well. What is your feeling about the viability of the recent Minsk agreements? What should we expect next? Of course, in the long run, as John Maynard Keynes used to remind us, we're all dead. But I'd rather not go there, okay? And some of my Russian friends say the answer to this question is easy. The problem will be solved when Russia becomes a fully democratic, tolerant, consolidated democracy. But I don't want to hold my breath that long. Okay, so if you can think about those two issues, let me just now encourage anyone and urge anyone to raise questions. And may I ask you to do two things. First of all, to introduce yourself so that our speakers know who they are addressing, and secondly, be brief. We have a question in the second row.
Good morning. My name is Mira Milosevic, and I'm a senior research fellow of Royal Institute Elь Kano. I have two questions. The first one is about the hybrid war. I think that by definition, hybrid warfare employs a broad range of tools. The war is only part of this process and not necessarily its most important part. Then combating hybrid war requires hybrid measures. You focused it, all of you, on propaganda war and regular and irregular forces in Donbass and Lugansk. My question is, what happened with another dimensions of hybrid war as economic warfare, cyber attacks, and so on? And more precisely, which kind of measures required hybrid war in Ukraine, and who are the fighters of this hybrid war? Think tankers, professors of universities, diplomacy. Who are the fighters? The second question is, which role can play a special understanding of interest of local power brokers, as for example Rinat Akhmedov, by Russian states? How Russia can use them in this hybrid war? And just one more question, if you have a time. I think that the best arm for Ukraine in the hybrid war is a successful of Ukraine, political, economic, all kind of success. And I miss in all your expositions a little bit more information about the reforms, political reforms, and about the plans of Ukrainian government for achieve this kind of success. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some interesting questions. Let's take two more. We have a star turnout this morning, 2 ambassadors in the front row. Yanis, if you would like to start.
Thank you. My name is Jan Zeegmans. I'm the Latvian ambassador to Spain. You had very interesting presentations. Unquestionably, you could think a lot about what you said. But what wasn't clear in your presentation is whether you can do a cause and effect relationship between what you were trying to describe, which is all some aspect of reality, I suppose, and what elements in what you said is the cause that created an effect. When the Biden started, it was an internal Ukraine affair. Well, if it wasn't, then please explain. But at any rate, what appeared, at least from the outside, as an internal question for the Ukrainians to decide internally about the reform of the Ukrainian state, half a year or so later, became completely something very different. And the question is, what is the cause and effect relationship between that event and what happened half a year or so later? And how what you have to say, what you just mentioned or you talked about, how does that relate to that cause and effect relationship? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador, would you like to?
Thank you very much. My name is Rasmus Lumi. I'm the ambassador of Estonia, and I have maybe a bit more specific question to Mr. Suhankin. In the latter part of your presentation, you mentioned external conditions that may be influencing the Russian nationalism, and I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit on that point, especially from the point of view of Ukraine. Maybe things happening currently, and in which direction do you see they might be influencing Russian nationalism in the near future? Thank you.
Okay, so let's tackle those 3 questions if you like. We had a first question about hybrid war, and also about local power structures, and finally an interesting issue that Mida raised about the new Ukrainian government. As she very rightly said, I think the future of Ukraine will largely depend on whether this government is serious about the reforms it needs to tackle. Second, cause and effect, and that's a big one. And thirdly, Russian nationalism. So who would like to start on the nature of the hybrid war and who is involved in the hybrid war?
Yeah, okay. I am involved in hybrid war, in reform, etc. So I can cover some of these issues. I just give you just one aspect of this hybrid war between Russia and Ukraine. I have a couple of years ago I observed the topic, which was a presentation of Ukrainian history in Russian history, and in Russian textbooks, and in Russian media, etc., etc. And I have established as the fact that real information war started in 2007. It was, first of all, it was at the train of historiography and representations of Holodomor, Great Famine of 32-33. Almost concurrently, Russia got into war with Estonia about the soldier statue, and with Latvia about the combatants and parades, and and it was also part of historical war over history with Georgia, so and with Poland over Katyń issue. So exactly in 2007, And if we will go further in analysis and we will look at this discursive form which are used now very intensively in informational war, like fascists, Nazi collaborators, etc., so we will go back to 2004. The elections of 2004, when Yushchenko was represented as in the uniform of Nazi, of Gestapo or whatever, I don't remember. And the word fascist started to use that time. It was exactly invented and promoted by Russian spin doctors, which were hired by Mr. Yanukovych at that time. So this is a part of this hybrid war. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Russia at this moment wins this war because level of disinformation and the misinterpretation of what is going on in Ukraine is extremely high in the West. Extremely high. I'm really, I can appreciate the level of funding of Life News and Russia Today, level of their influence, etc. I'm traveling to the West, I'm speaking to different people, and this really works, unfortunately. Well, we're living in informational age. So as to Mr. Akhmetov and his role in different, so Akhmetov now do something for displaced persons. He really helps them. There are some talks I know, it's unofficial information, of course. I know about some talks about his help with probably his support for universities in exile, because it's a couple of dozens of universities fled from these territories. So, however, his role in these events is still unclear. There are different options that probably at initial phase he tried to play a certain game, which also failed because much more powerful players from outside came to the field, and then he was just thrown out by these players. And about reform, I'm a head of a strategy advisory group at the Ministry of Education and Sciences. We have prepared a roadmap of reform, and looking from inside, I can understand these people who say that it is really, extreme challenge. Not just in terms of war, lack of finances, financial crisis, economical crisis, in terms of attitudes, perceptions, and what I would call a path dependency. People are really, in their heads, in their habits, in their instincts, they're really dependent on the path. And this is the major challenge now for reform, when people still think in the terms of the past. And this makes provides a kind of dynamics or absence of dynamics, which endanger reforms at whole.
Thank you.
Cause and effect. Who's the brave?
If I can, I just want to add just a couple of words to the notion of hybrid war. Just two small statements about the local power brokers like Akhmetov. For the Russian intervention, they were not of. They have played a very ambiguous role, I'd say, but the local elites who really supported these pro-Russian uprisings were, let's say, elites from, second or even third ranks. And, important thing for this was the example of the Crimea annexation. So if a typical criminal like Sergei Aksyonov, nicknamed Goblin, can become a prime minister of Crimea, so why shouldn't it be possible in Donbass? Yes, and this was kind of motivation for those people. Yeah, just so much about that. And the question for the fighters of the hybrid war, this is, probably one of the few unique things about this war, that everybody can be a fighter, you know. So if you want to fight in this informational war, you can just shoot. You can turn on your Facebook and indulge in fightings. The impact will be, of course, minimal in that case. But anyway, you can, have this feeling of being inside a fight. And as for the more complicated question of the cause and relations, I'm not sure I've got it right. So maybe we can make a kind of short dialogue on this. So. The question was how this internal issue of, say, protests in Ukraine turned into external war. This, if I get it right. Well, in fact, it wasn't. I would say it wasn't internal from the very beginning, because it was triggered. Well, the protests in Kiev were triggered by the EU association agreement and the reluctance of President Yanukovych to undersign it. Of course, the agenda of protests were growing constantly as long as the reluctance was there. But you know, it wasn't internal from the very beginning. When this is again only our perception that the war started some half a year ago, but in fact we often forget the case of Crimea, which was annexed, and
Maybe that's
yes.
Okay. And anyone else? No? Okay.
Yeah, just about causes and well, internal and external. I support the idea of that events in Ukraine from the very beginning were not just internal matter. Of course, outside players who didn't believe that they are outside players did their best to invest into this. Referring to your, Charles, to your EU wrongdoings, probably there were some wrongdoings in the fall of 2013 when Yanukovych was, well, just faced the dilemma, either there or there. No any kind of middle way between that. And and he made his decision with consequences we are observed now. But if we speak about causes, internal causes, Ukraine is quite, in many cases, really not Russia. You know, when people say it's a joke, but it's true, that OMON, the special riot forces, appear in Moscow, people disperse. When the riot force appears in the center of Kiev, people getting there. And this is the difference. So the major cause, probably, it would last for months. Maidan would last for months. But the mistake was, and I believe that this mistake was made under pressure from outside, is that Yanukovych and his heirs tried to make the level of pressure, which was really intolerable in society. And you remember probably that the final point was when certain laws were passed by the parliament, absolutely in a non-democratic way, but they were passed by the parliament. There were very good laws, by the way, in this package. But some of them were absolutely intolerable. And in Ukraine, the specifics of Ukraine that you can live under Yanukovych for years. There is a kind of contact social between society and rulers that we imitate something and we imitate something. So we're imitated, we're law-abiding, and we imitate that we produce good laws, etc. But if you want to shut mouth of, if people will be deprived of their right to speak, that would be the final point. And I believe that after 16th of January, that was the major cause was that people were deprived of right to speak openly and to express themselves. And that was final cut in this operation when real rebellion started in this case, at least for external observer.
Okay, Sergei, your question about nationalism?
Speaking of the rift within Russian society, within the Russian nationalists and the war in Ukraine, I'd say that there are two major stages. First of all, the annexation of Crimea, it did unite the Russian nationalist movement. However, the war in Ukraine provided a significant rift within the movement, primarily due to the fact that the causes of the war in Ukraine have not been understood within Russian nationalist milieu. The first group that emerged supported the idea that was allegedly put forth by Azov and the right sector, Azov battalion and the right sector, that boiled down to the thesis of creation of Ukraine as a white mono-ethnic nation, so-called white power for, yes. And the second one, and it was supported by a certain fraction within Russian society. And the second group emerged that stood for principles defended by the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic, some sort of a peculiar combination between Christian values, the Soviet legacy, the Cossack movement, so everything that pertained to both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And, the major evidence could be found during the march, the last march, yes, that was going on in Moscow, where several columns appeared to have bearing various standards, various mottos, one supporting Kiev, and the second group supporting the DNR-LNR. So.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for another quick round. There's a question in the second row, then the second one there. Friends from the Russian embassy leaving. They've had enough, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Carlos Gasco. I work in Iberdrola, the power utility. I have two very down-to-earth questions related to my interest in this crisis, which is economic sanctions. I would like to hear the opinion of the table around the economic sanctions of the European Union and the role of the role of energy in the crisis. From a very personal point of view, I would like to, perform an exercise of crystal balling, and maybe, the panelists can predict what is the most likely unfolding of events and what is it that we can expect out of this crisis, because the more I know about it, the less I seem to foresee from a, let's say, reasonable point of view to see an exit to this at some point. Thank you very much.
The crystal ball is a bit misty right now. Yes, in the third row.
Well, I'm Servando de la Torre. I'm a retired diplomat. My question is that whether in the Maidan movement or now, what were the positions about the constant permanent presence of the Russian Navy in Sevastopol? And second, is there any way, when this, Ukraine now seems to want to disengage from the security system that prompts Russia, then does Ukraine think that needs an alternative security system? Thank you.
Okay, and a little further behind. Let's take a third question.
Good morning. My name is Ignacio Rodriguez, and I'm Associate Fellow at the Legal History Department, Tilburg University in the Netherlands. My question has been triggered by the concluding remarks of Mr. Powell about the past behavior of the European Union. A few weeks ago, a select committee of the House of Lords published a report noticing that, and I quote, that there was a strong element of sleepwalking into the relations with Russia, with member states of the European Union being taken by surprise by events in Ukraine, end quote. The report referred to the lack of political oversight, but taking care the intervention of Mr. Savico, and thinking in the legal element of the behavior of the European Union through the sanctions established in mid-2014 and the reaction of Sergei Lavrov regarding the difficult understanding of how the European Union could do that according to the prevailing rules of international law, I would like you to develop a little bit further the legal implications of the interference of the European Union in this crisis, if it might be called as a civil war, and before in the Syrian crisis. for Sergei Lavrov himself, criticized the different regimes of sanctions established by the European Union in 2013, and particularly that establishing a sort of blockade against Syria, affecting states which were not members of the European Union, like Russia itself. Thank you very much.
Right. I thought Ukraine was ambitious enough. Now we have to talk about Syria as well. Okay. We have a very powerful panel. So let's go to Iberdrola first. Who would like to tackle that? The economic sanctions and the energy dilemmas. And of course, one of Mr. Yanukovych's finance ministers was arrested in Spain yesterday. I'm very happy to see that it isn't just British crooks who end up on the Costa. Anyone would like to tackle energy?
I can, but well, first of all, just say I'm not an economist. Yes, so I cannot assess it. It's not a kind of expertise what I'm going to say now. Yes, kind of expertise can be the analysis of sanctions as a part of the whole discourse of war. And there is a kind of paradox, at least in Germany and the Central European countries, that those people who advocate the sanctions, they actually say we are for sanctions because we want Russia back to the legal system. Yes, and those who oppose sanctions, they let's leave it as it is. As far as I know, from my conversation with the economists in Germany, in Austria, and some other countries. European Union has a real gamut of mechanism pressing Russian economy, with the oil embargo being probably the most effective of those. And my personal opinion, which is not an expert opinion, is that the sanctions do work. Maybe they do not work to the expected extent, but they have really impact on Russia's policy in Ukraine. And this leads me to your second question, the prediction, how it's going to work. Well, I can make a quite simple prediction of where Mr. Putin is going to stop. And he is going to stop at that point at which he will be stopped. Otherwise, he will just continue to do it as long as he can. That's it.
Okay, yes, please.
May I add to the sanctions? Well, unfortunately, the sanctions have also caused skyrocketing of popularity of Mr. Putin. And, judging by historical experience, Russian population can brook enormous hardships. And, judging by the level and the smartness of Russian propaganda, the Russian population can brook really for a long time. There won't be a replication of 1970s or beginning of 1980s because there are alternative partners for Russia. Naturally, foreclosure of Russia to Europe will bring grave consequences for the Russian Federation as well, but it will be in much longer run than we can predict right now. So certain, as Alla Hurska said, Ukraine is a hostage, and the European Union should have predicted the huge reaction of the Russian Federation to any single attempt to encroach upon Russian interests in Ukraine. We should have learned history better, I guess. Russia never hesitated to use its leverage on the post-Soviet spaces in order to secure its spheres of influence, at least what Russia considers to be its spheres of influence. So, the time will show, but as I said.
Okay, thank you. You had the question about the Russian Navy in Sebastopol.
And the security system.
And the security system.
Yeah, I could reflect on the security system. I didn't get the point about the Navy in Sebastopol. What
was your point about the Navy, Ambassador? Is Mike?
The question is Ukrainian government ready to negotiate a new agreement with Russia as for the military base in Sebastopol. Second, Ukraine was in the security system of the former Soviet Union together with Russia, was an ally. Now it's not. But is Ukraine looking for a new security system for itself and ready to associate to any other security system, or should remain neutral?
Okay, so the debate on NATO membership and neutrality
and
Finlandization.
I would try to reflect on that. First of all, to the best of my knowledge, there is no negotiations about Sebastopol and Black Sea Fleet. The remnants of the Black Sea Fleet left for Odessa, and they're still there, or in other parts, in other ports. In fact, Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, has acknowledged Russia as a country aggressor. So Ukraine still has an ambassador there, but you understand that at this point, any kind of normal talks about Sebastopol just impossible. Just for Russia, it's Russian territory, and this is it. About security system, Ukraine for years, for decades, Ukraine kept the idea of out of bloc status. All opinion polls about NATO, joining NATO, always show the majority of those who are against joining NATO. Probably in recent year, in 2014, the number of those who against or who oppose this idea reduced, but it's still quite a big share of those who do not want to go to NATO. I myself would not vote for joining NATO at this moment, so how Ukraine should build security. Ukraine, by the way, was not part of Ukraine-Russia security bloc. I would like to remind the episode of 2003 about the small, the island in Black Sea when Russia claimed it's Russian, Ukraine claimed, and then there was a kind of almost mobilization in Ukraine for, at least right nationalists tried to mobilize. So Ukraine was not part of Ukrainian-Russian bloc, never. There was a great 1997 agreement and was part of military issues there, but there was not a agreement on cooperation and real cooperation. Ukraine was a part of NATO programs, by the way. But as to the future, now Ukraine is in a very specific condition when the elites has to make their choice, and situation of war does not give any chances, for instance, to organize, let's say, referendum over NATO accession.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one last question here.
Another question.
My name is Valeriu Georgiou. I am ambassador of Moldova to Spain. My question is, Ukraine and Russia both are parties of the so-called format 5+2. How do you see the activities, the future activities, the next activities of this format? Now with the special relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And how do you see the role of OSCE in Ukraine now? Thank you.
Anyone want to take that? We have Borja de las Heras in the room. Do we have Borja de las Heras? He's disappeared because he's our expert on OECD.
Well, I know something about OECD mission now, and we also, we have some projects with OECD in education, for instance. But generally, if you speak about mission there in the East, so it is, it is very complicated since there is a lot of, let's say, attempts to imitate, a kind of, not from OECD part, but from both sides, by the way, to imitate what is required to be done there. So, but in this case, there is a great lack of information about this. It's very specific information. Sometimes it's even classified. So if you look at the media, at electronic media, you probably will not find a lot which will enable you to have a kind of to make a kind of conclusions or analytics.
Okay.
But I just would add briefly to the situation in the East. The status of the OSCE is very important, even in this informational campaign and in this informational war. So there are some statements of the OSCE about, say, shelling of local villages there. If they can prove that this was done by Ukrainian army or by the insurgency, this is a kind of court ruling for both fighting parties, or for conflict parties, and for their supporters. So if the OSCE says it's your fault, then okay, we should admit that. And this is really remarkable. So the status of the OSCE shouldn't be underestimated, despite of many attempts to instrumentalize their mission in Donbass.
Okay, we have time for one final question.
Well, it's not a question, it's a remark.
If you can introduce yourself.
It's not a question, it's a remark. First of all, I would like to thank all the guests for the participation in this event. The judgments are very useful. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the El Kano Royal Institute. I have forgot to say that I represent the Ukrainian embassy. My name is Vyacheslav Voronov. And speaking about the hybrid war, it's very difficult to speak about, to give assessments of future, but I think it's my opinion that maybe now, after Putin has achieved its main goal in this conflict in Donbass, I mean to have an area of instability, which will give him the possibility to influence the policy. Well, I expect that it will not be the case, but many people in Moscow think that by this policy in Donbass, the Kremlin will influence the policy, the foreign policy of Ukraine. That I think that in the future, in future months, there will be more important soft components of the hybrid war. The military component will be less important. Well, in this, continuing this idea, I think that a lot will depend on the people of Ukraine, of the government, of the president, if the people of Ukraine will be able to counter this hybrid war by economic means, by information means. The propaganda is really tremendous, and in Ukraine, in the Western countries, in Spain particularly. Maybe our guests could give the ideas about what we can expect in the future, speaking about the hybrid war.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, it's, what time is it? It's 10 to 2. I'm sorry, I think we've more or less consumed the time that was available. I just did want to say something very briefly about the comparison that was raised between Russia and Syria, the accusation of double standards and so on. Let me also say, by the way, the House of Lords report is a very good report. I strongly encourage everyone to read that. But I think it's important to remember something. Formally, Russia is supposedly a strategic partner of the European Union. I know it's a bit of a joke right now, but and of NATO. But we have 10 strategic partnerships in the world, and our partnership with Russia is supposedly one of those very precious and special relationships. Our relationship with Syria is obviously an entirely different ballgame. We don't really even have interlocutors in Syria. So I think while the accusation of double standards is understandable, I think that the EU shouldn't flagellate itself more than is absolutely necessary, although, as you know, that is a national sport in most EU capitals. Okay, well, thank you very much. Time is up, and I just want to thank all of the speakers for their very interesting presentations, and I hope they will continue to come to Spain to enlighten us on the nature of this crisis, which is extremely complex and multidimensional, as we have witnessed this afternoon. And thank you all for your presence and for supporting this Royal Elcano activity. Thank you.